So we're ready to go? Okay, folks, let's get started. So welcome to the January 10th. Good. The January 10th Doctoral Student Colloquium. I'm Janet Sloan, and I'm going to be the faculty moderator for this afternoon. We're very pleased to welcome all of our attendees, both on campus here in the room, as well as online, including our School of Education faculty, staff, and students. The Doctoral Student Colloquium is a series that the School of Education offers, and it's an opportunity for our doctoral students to share their original research and to learn from their peers, their faculty, and the staff. Each month, one MD student and one PhD student presents their research at the colloquium. These sessions are really important for our doctoral students so that they connect with each other and develop a peer community that is invaluable in supporting their journeys within our program. Each doctoral student also writes a research brief that relates to his or her presentation, which is then included in an edited publication entitled Doctoral Student Research Briefs, which we publish both on our website. The research brief is a way to disseminate our students' research as shared in the colloquium in a concise format with relevance to education. Each of our presentations, we have two, will have about 20 minutes to share their research, and then we will move to questions and answers. Please save your questions for the question and answer comment. Our first presenter today is Mark Petrovich. He's a third-year PhD student in the School of Education with a concentration in STEM education. And this is actually his second doctoral colloquium. He is a research assistant within Drexel University School of Education, as well as a member of the Games and Learning and Interactive Digital Environments Lab, the GLIDE Lab. His research interests include educational technology, informal learning, maker-centered learning, motivation, and identity exploration. Mark earned his BS/MS in digital media from Drexel University in 2012. Since that time, he has served as an adjunct professor in the digital media department and a freelance designer for projects involving web development, user interface, user experience design, and video production. His current research examines teaching and learning within informal contexts, using immersive technologies such as augmentative and virtual reality. I'm not going to hold this against him, but he spends his Sundays cheering for the AFC North champion Baltimore Ravens, who currently hold the #1 seed in the AFC. I might hold against him. Today, Mark will be speaking about learning by making, investigating students' identity exploration using environmental science and art. I think we're in for a real treat. Mark?
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here and online. So today, like I said, I'll be presenting to you Learning by Making, investigating students' identity exploration using environmental science and art. So what I want to talk about a little bit is my last colloquium was in May of 2019, and this is an expansion upon that. So in this last colloquium, I presented actually students' interest development and how they transfer interest through a 4-week environmental science and art course. And so we just looked at 2 cases, Camilla and Avi, and we kind of saw the differences in how they went qualitatively. And then this is going to expand upon that, and instead of looking just at interest, it's going to be more of an integrated identity that we'll look at. Very briefly, I'm going to talk through some of the literature. This is going to be the only theoretical aspect of this because there's a lot to talk about on the back end. But essentially, educational research on learning and making has been becoming more popular. There's studies saying, you can see up here in the top right, 3Doodler, which is like a little 3D printing pen, Little Bits, which we used for this study, as well as Makey Makey. All these things have affordances for improving or changing, impacting students' interest, identity. However, there's been relatively few investigations that have revealed which theoretical and pedagogical frameworks or theories are useful approaches for actually using making. There's also been few studies published on how the interactions between self and learning can affect and impact students' interests and identities. And finally, few studies that actually assess or have strategies for understanding how student processes work when using learning by making. And specifically with that, what we're talking about is kind of the artifacts that students make when they're doing learning by making, and how we actually use those as assessment tools, or what the outcomes of those tools are. So in order to address some of these gaps, the research question that we've proposed for this study is, in what ways did students in a maker-centered course engage in the exploration of identities related to environmental science and art? And then what the theoretical framework that we used for this was projective reflection. And it should be said that we didn't just use this as a theoretical framework, but also as a pedagogical framework. So both how we thought about identity throughout the experience, but also in used it to shape the actual intervention as well. So projective reflection is a theory that frames learning as a longitudinal change over time, or what we call identity exploration. And it's made up of 4 key constructs. You can see the constructs along the left side, but just note that the acronym is KIVS, so knowledge, interest, value, self-perception, self-definition, self-organization, self-control. So the first construct, knowledge, is just how people think, what they know, their technical literacy. Interest and values is kind of like their predisposition to re-engage with the content, the value that they place on something, whether it be a content or an intervention. Their self-perception, self-definitions, how they see themselves, and this could be something that goes from the past, the present, the future. It's not set in a certain environment. It can go across those times. And then finally, their self-organization and self-control, or how they work. So that as they work alone with a more knowledgeable other, with a peer, or if they work in a large group to address a collective problem. And so when talking about projective reflection, it's also important to note that we're not just looking at these individualized constructs. It's not about what does somebody know, where are their interests. It's about an integrated identity. So we're talking about how or what the relationships are between the constructs. So what's the relationship between someone's knowledge and their interest and values, or their interest and values and their self-perception and self-definitions? So when we're talking about PR, we're looking at how these relationships work. So like I said, when we were talking about this project, this is an expansion of the colloquium from last year, and this all stems from a School of Education faculty research initiative, which led to a project called Invent with Environment. So Invent with Environment is actually an environmental science and art course, which took place at the Schuylkill Center, which I'll get to in a slide or two. But that's the basic information for now. And you'll see that with this project, we took a design-based research approach. So it started in the summer of 2018. Data analysis obviously is still ongoing. This is the colloquium for that. But there's a lot of stuff that went on into this project. So starting in fall of 2018, we actually had a 2-week professional development with 3 environmental educators at the Schuylkill Center. And with this, we as the observers and as the researchers use this as an opportunity to teach the educators about the little bits that we'd be using, which are the maker technology, and then created or co-created a course, which then came out in course iteration 1, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. So through that professional development, we created that 4-week maker course. After the 4-week maker course, we spent time reflecting and redesigning using that design-based research approach, thinking about what feedback we could get. So we used the student feedback and their artifacts, our own reflections, observations, memos, the teachers' memos and observations, as well as feedback from parents that were also there as like chaperones. We took all that information and then we made changes and then did another cycle of enactment in spring 2019, which manifested as a 7-week course iteration. And just so you can see like some of the changes we've made, like that's an obvious one, right? We've expanded this course from 4 weeks to 7. We also expanded the time per week. So it started off as like a 90 minute per week. We expanded that to 120. So 30 extra minutes, 3 more weeks. Another thing was that what we tried to do was be more intentional and targeted in what we were trying to give the students. So for example, with their final project, there are a lot of topics that I'll talk about briefly that students could do a final project on, but they were kind of misguided or a little lost in what they really should be addressing or which one was most important. So trying to give them more specific guides in this is the approach that you could use, but we wanted them to take their own. So it was kind of balancing out, giving them those instructions, but also letting them be free in their exploration of these areas. So like I said, the Schuylkill Center was the context for this and where everything occurred, the professional development and both groups. The Schuylkill Center is one of the first urban environmental education centers in the US. It has 4 key pillars, which are environmental education, environmental art, land stewardship, and wildlife rehabilitation. They do already have some education facilities about K-12, and they also they do broadly STEM, but also focus on environmental science and art. Then we also partnered with the Centro de Cultura, Arte, Trabajo y Educación, or CICATE. CICATE focuses mainly on groups that have immigrated to the United States. So you can see that we had an even split between 18 high school students of 9 male and 9 female students, and all identified as Hispanic, Mexican, or Mexican American. And just to give you a small idea of kind of the structure of the course, so this was the winter session, so only 90 minutes long, but ran for 4 weeks. So you see our weeks 1 was the starting self for projective reflection, the beginning. Weeks 2 and 3, we had labeled as the exploration of possible selves, and then week 4 was a new self. What I want to note here is that while we have EPS as 2 and 3, the exploration of possible selves doesn't just happen in that time period. It's still happening throughout these other weeks, but for our data set, like that's how we have labeled it. So you'll see that there's a little bit different structure here. Introductions, they're kind of getting the idea of what little bits are. So it's a slightly different course structure, but weeks 2, 3, and 4 all follow a very similar course structure. And what I really want you to focus on is just the different topics that they're getting introduced to. So in weeks 2, the connections between people and nature. 3, the interconnectedness of land, water, and trees. And then 4, the diversity of people and ideas to support environmental science and art. So these are all things that they're being asked to create projects about using little bits. And when I say little bits, so these are just little modular bits, literally like about that size in your hand. They're color-coded. Blue ones are for power. The green are outputs. Yeah, outputs. So you can have like a buzzer. You can have just like a big scoreboard. You can have colors, flashing lights. And then pink is an input. So you have sliders, touch, voice activation. And then you essentially merge all these little bits together and create a circuit to do whatever you want. So things that kids were doing in order to use these little bits were to address like the overpopulation of deer. And so deer management at the Schuylkill Center. Seed bombing, how do you spread plants throughout the area that the deer are all eating? So these are just like some ideas of projects that they could use to address this. In terms of data collection, everything in yellow is something that we utilized for this project today. So this is going to be for the epistemic networks that we'll talk about in a couple slides. You can see the only thing that we didn't use is we have not gotten to coding all the artifacts and video recordings yet, but those will be coming up soon. In terms of data analysis, the first process is the data organization. And I know it's kind of small, but you can see that using quantitative ethnography, which has epistemic network analysis as a subset of that, and if you're interested in more quantitative ethnography, come to Glide Lab. We do have some sessions that Amanda Braney has been hosting, so a little shout out to her. So if we're looking at this data organization for epistemic network analysis, you'll see that everything within each column has to be the same, exactly in terms of format, in terms of what information is there. And then you also have to have a consistency across the rows. Like all the information, again, has to be the same here as well. So even though activity type changes between the rows here at 7 and 8, it's the same type of information. So there is still a consistency throughout the rows and columns. Following this, we also conducted a directed content analysis. And what I mean here is all the way over on the right-hand slide in, what is that, O and P? I fail my glasses test right now. So O and P, you have knowledge, interest, and valuing. Those are the projective reflection constructs. So we're actually coding those 0 for an absence of that construct, 1 for the presence of that construct, all the way down for every single row. So we're seeing which construct we're seeing in the data coming out from the students. And then finally, we're going to use all this information to put it into the ENA software, which will give us visualizations of the actual relationships between the projective reflection constructs as illustrated through ENA. And so when we're talking about ENA, ENA is a technique essentially for modeling those connections and demonstrating the strength of connections between different constructs. So when talking about ENA, there's a few things in terms of the analysis. Part of it is units, conversations, and codes. The units essentially are just your unit of analysis. So the units for this presentation were identity exploration phases. So you can see starting self here, new self, and exploring possible selves. Same three things I've been saying, those are the units, as well as students. We see all these little dots, purple, blue, all that stuff. Those are student dots. The conversation is how you're going to break things up in terms of time. So chronologically, how do you think your data fits together? And that's going to be a week. We could also do this by activity, because activities occurred chronologically. But at this point, we've just done it by week because the activities fit into those weeks as well. And then finally, the codes, what we actually want to see represented in our epistemic networks. So the codes are the 4 constructs. We're going to see the KIVS acronym coming up in these epistemic networks. And then finally, what's really important that really brings together the projective reflection as well as the ENA is this moving stanza window. So ENA utilizes the moving stanza window in order to make relationships between whatever code you're on and -1, like that number of things before it. So essentially the code I'm on and the 3 before it, it's making connections between those codes. So if I went back to this, we'd be seeing code here that goes over for the whole 4 codes of KIVS, but then it makes connections to the previous 3 behind it. Like that's the four-step moving stanza window. So by making those connections, it's being able to tell a strength between those different constructs. And before we get into the actual visualizations, I just want to say you're going to be seeing these very similar. The shape of these does not matter whatsoever. It's important to note that it could be a triangle, a square, a circle. The shape of the actual thing on the screen doesn't matter. Its placement, you can very faintly see the axes here. Its placement on the axis also does not matter. Don't worry about any of those things. The color is just going to tell you which network we're looking at. What does matter is the placement of these 4 dots and then the means, like other dots that are around it, and it'll be a little more clear in a second. And then finally, the thickness or strength of relationship between the other constructs. So what these dots are going to be are the 4 constructs of KIVS, and then the relationships between each of those constructs. So we'll get into examples. For example, this is what you would see if you just loaded up ENA. You're going to see the starting self with its dotted line confidence interval, as well as the exploration of possible selves, and then you'll see the new self. What's really important about this first diagram is that we note the confidence intervals for these 2 overlap. The confidence intervals between new self and exploring selves and starting self and exploring self don't overlap whatsoever. So what we expect from this is that we're going to see a significant difference between the means of those networks. And that's exactly what we see. So when we do a paired sample t-test between starting and exploring selves, we have a significant difference in those means. And we see a significant difference between exploring possible selves and new selves. So these are some things to note, that if those confidence intervals overlap, you're probably not going to have significance when you're looking at these ENA documents. Now this graph is going to be the general for all students. So it's 8 students. I know the sample is 18, but 8 are the only ones that completed the full data set. So we have 8 students here. This is the mean average for their starting self, for their new self, and for their exploration of possible selves. Remember, the shape doesn't necessarily matter, but the placement of this mean in relation to the 4 constructs. So first things first, we see that this network, which is the starting self, has the strongest relationship between self-perception, self-definition, and interest in values. And then we can see that it's probably even tilted more towards self-perception, self-definition, because it's pulled all the way to the left here in relation to the other constructs, which are more centered or right-leaning. We can see that it has the weakest connections between knowledge, self-organization, self-control, and maybe a little bit of knowledge and interest in valuing. But these are things that I want to talk a little qualitatively about when we get to the final visualization. Then between weeks 2 and 3, when they're exploring possible selves, we see this change pretty dramatically, right? Remember, shape doesn't matter, but we see now that there's a really thick line between knowledge and interest and valuing. And we see the actual mean for exploring possible selves pulls way off to the right. So they're probably being impacted a lot by knowledge. The mean is almost on the line here. So they really are going right along that connection. So what's interesting about this is that generally when when we're using projective reflection for this, we would expect to see these reversed. So the starting self would kind of look like this with more knowledge, more interest and value, whereas the exploration of possible selves, they'd start making more of these connections between how they see themselves, how they're working with other people, with themselves. But it's reversed here. And I kind of have a theory for that, because as you come to new self, you'll see it's almost identical to the starting self. The thought here is that the way that we have coded the pre and post test, which is wholly quantitative, is that it's more deductive, so coming from what we want. If we had coded it inductively, that we might have seen it branch out a little bit more. Like we were looking for very specific things in the survey, and they happen to manifest in this way within ENA. So that's an approach that we can take and kind of know moving forward for the design of these interventions. I'm not going to touch on the difference model right now, but one thing that I wanted to talk about very quickly is looking at individual students as moving forward. So this was a student named Alejandra, pseudonym just in case. But so in the top right, you can see this is her exploration of possible selves. This is her new self, and this is her starting self. These are all her means for those levels of identity exploration. If you put up the confidence intervals, remember those large dotted box, she's an outlier in every single one, especially here. She's pulled up way, way far away from the rest of everybody else. Everybody here is particularly grouped together. There's some grouping here. These two are outliers in the opposite direction, but I think she's the only one that's an outlier in all three. So why is that? That's something that's really interesting to me and something we should look at in the future. Specifically, this is her exploration of possible selves. Her average, remember she's way up north in comparison to the group average. So we see that she has much stronger connections between self-perception, self-definition, and knowledge, which is what we expected to see. So what is it about her exploration? What did she get? What did she reflect on that got her up there during that phase in comparison to everybody else, the rest of the group that was down here? So that's really interesting for us and something that we should explore further. So in wrapping this up, we did see an identification of all these projective reflection constructs in these epistemic networks. We didn't necessarily see them all integrated. Remember the thickness of all the lines, we're seeing these things happen at different places, but we really want them all working together and seeing the relationships between them. So what's interesting about this is that we're not seeing all of these things pop up in large detail or in strength. So again, this could be about the intervention design. You know, what could we change about this intervention? And that's one of those things where when we bring in the spring data, we can evaluate that further instead of just having the winter. So the opportunities in session 1 versus session 2, some of those things are like going outdoors. You know, they all said, hey, why can't we go outdoors? This is an environmental center. It was winter and they didn't bring coats. So that happens. So I expect there are going to be some changes based on having the longer periods to be outside, different activities they could do, more opportunities. Also things that we're talking about, so the differences between the first phase and the last phase, being about the survey design, the data analysis. So thinking about the data collection methods and how we might be able to change those moving forward in order to really make them for epistemic network analysis and seeing the changes across those periods. As always, with like a quantitative aspect of this, the sample size, we went from 18 to 8 for this first portion. Part of that is going to be reconciled by adding in that second group, the spring session. So expanding that analysis to include the cross-case analysis, also moving forward, making larger interventions and seeing if we can actually get significance across a large amount of cases. And then finally, the data collection methods, like I've said several times, just ensuring that we're using the proper data analysis, that we hit and make the ENA visualizations the way that we'd expect to kind of see them. References. thank you very much to Amanda Braney. She has been instrumental in helping me figure out what the hell ENA is. And if you don't know, or if you want questions, Amanda's here. I'm also here, but to a lesser degree. Cohort 4, everybody in the room, Augie, Allie, Brian's in the back because he didn't want to be near me. If anybody's online, thank you very much. Glide members, obviously. Dr. Mamta Shah, who helped the intervention, led the intervention when we were undertaking this at Schuylkill Center, as well as my advisor, Dr. Ruth Foster. Thank you very much. Any questions?
So at this point, we'll take questions both online and in the room tomorrow.
Yeah, Toma.
Great presentation, thank you. My question refers to the directionality of the change. When you show the visualization, this one, I was wondering, so this gives information about the degree of change, like thickness, the degree of change, the strength of change, I guess, from interest, knowledge, like self-perception, theories to self-perception, like the connection. I was wondering, do you also have information, can you get from this some kind of information about the direction of, like, what type of change? Is it like a positive change, like they changed towards like perceiving themselves more as scientists, or maybe they mentioned something negative, like I definitely know now that I don't want to be a scientist. Like when you go back to your initial coding, ones and zeros, did you code one every time they mentioned anything about being a scientist or not being, or you mentioned one when it was a positive?
Right. So yes, we coded one every time they mentioned the subject, which is part of the issue that we talked about with data analysis. But one of the things that I'm trying to follow up on with the epistemic analysis group is the fact that you can weight different codes. So if you go back to this, you can actually weight these as different values. It doesn't have to just be ones and zeros. But that's something that we're figuring out how that affects and how you have to set up your data in order to make that interpretation happen in the ENA. So yes, that's a great question and something we're looking to do.
Yeah, I guess in this case, the desired change would be any change.
Right.
If they are able to intentionally reflect, right?
As long as it reflects on the construct, yeah. But with the weighting, and if you were to weight negative, you have to think about how that affects the rest of the data. So it's about balancing the changes in those data, but that's a great question, and we're definitely looking into how to do that. Can we ignore you? Oh, not a question. Okay, great.
What advantage do quantitative ethnography? Because it's not just quantitative. You can actually click on that single quantitative coin and go back to see was this a positive or negative.
Yeah,
so you can
explore more.
Yes, yeah. With traditional qualitative you can't do that. So that's an advantage of
Other questions in the room or online?
Yeah, good.
When you're talking about the survey, the assess survey, you said that you discovered that it was more deductive than inductive.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just speak a little bit more to that and like how you would change it in order to do it again?
Yeah, so we specifically, so have you built, the pre-post survey? So I know how social and environmental issues are connected to my life. I find science useful in my life. Like we're looking at very specific answers there. All these questions are coded to, like in our code book, are coded to knowledge, interest, value, SOS, or SOSC, SPSD, right? So we're looking at those 4 constructs. We're coding deductively in that we're looking for those constructs. So if they answered, if they had an answer to that, it's coded as addressing one of those constructs. Whereas really, it's on a Likert scale, like a 5-point Likert. So really we should be weighting as like, if they strongly agreed that they find science useful in their life, that should be a different, like a different code that affects thickness differently, right? Like they're making stronger connections if they're agreeing more strongly. So to do an inductive code, instead of just looking directly at what the question's asking, we really would be looking at what the student is saying. So like even some of our qualitative answers are coded somewhat deductively, but also inductively. So there's like a back and forth coding between these. But like that's a little example of how you might code those differently. Yeah.
So we have time for one more question.
Yes.
So imagine you were speaking to a layperson. and you wanted to say the impact of my research on students' engagement with environmental sort of science and art might be or could be or what hoping is. How would you phrase that?
Yeah, so I think that part of this is, oh, I turned this off. Part of this is figuring out how to design the intervention, right? So what did we design? Which activity is most important to them exploring a certain aspect of identity? One part. Second part, which aspects of identity did they actually undergo? Where are they making connections? Where are they seeing themselves moving forward? What has this inspired them to do? So a lot of these visualizations, we can make those connections to the qualitative data, but these are nice ways of giving us a direction as to like, this is where we're going to go look next. But a lot of it revolves around figuring out what the best approach was, looking at the intervention, and then the actual steps of identity exploration afterwards.
And thanks so much, Mark. Enjoy the thanks, Jamie, and thank you, Mark, for presenting. And then our second speaker today is Jackie Murphy. She's one of our EVD students, and she's studying the effects of an open mindfulness course on student persistence, stress, and mind wandering. She is also an assistant clinical professor in the College of Nursing and Health Professions. Specifically, Jackie teaches students in the graduate nursing and complementary and integrative health programs. Today, Jackie will be joining us via Zoom, and she'll be presenting on her research, exploring the effects of an open access mindfulness course on online graduate student persistence, stress, and mind wandering, a mixed methods explanatory sequential study. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Jackie.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me here today. It's exciting. And just before I get started, I just want to thank my advisor, Dr. Betts. She has just been so instrumental in this whole process, and I can't thank her enough. So we'll get started. You heard the title of my presentation. So I'm currently in dissertation phase. So I've completed collecting all of my data, and I'm currently analyzing all of that data. So the results I'll be presenting are preliminary today. So I'll be doing some more the background information and then some preliminary results at the end. So just first, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to my topic. So like I said, I am looking at graduate students, and specifically online graduate students. So what I found is that online enrollment continues to grow. And in 2016, over 6 million students took at least one online class. So as online enrollment is growing, we find though that schools are still struggling with retention and increased attrition. So, you know, how to hold on to these students, how to keep these students and help them persist to graduation. We find in the literature, you know, these online graduate students are struggling a lot because they're trying to balance everything. You know, I know that a lot of us can relate to this, but trying to balance work and school and other, you know, family responsibilities and so on. And that stress can really impact their academic performance. So something else we know from the literature is that our students are stressed. So in a rather large survey, we found that in 2017, 59.8% of the students who took the survey reported experiencing higher than average stress rates. And 1 in 5 of those students reported that their stress impacted their academic performance. So it's a real problem for schools and for students to really figure out how we can help our students be successful. So I just want to go into a little bit more of the background of, you know, graduate online enrollment. So why is this important and what is the impact? Well, as we all know, student loan debt is just really growing. I think we're at $1.56 trillion that students owe. And if our students are, you know, taking some courses, but then they're not persisting to graduation, well, then they're coming out of school without a new degree to really support them to make more money to pay back these loans. So that's a problem. We're seeing rise in tuition. So we really need to find ways that we can help retain our students. And as I alluded to in the literature, there are factors that show what supports persistence and what hinders persistence. And just to be clear, persistence is continuing from one term to the next. So one of the big factors, like I said, that hinders persistence is having to balance everything. So just, online, especially enrollment attracts students because of the perceived flexibility. Students think, oh, I can go to school and work and have my family and I'll just do schoolwork, at night. And then they realize that it's really hard to balance all of that. Another factor is stress. That stress that could potentially stem from balancing everything can hinder academic success and persistence. And then we find that what supports persistence, and one of those things is having an academic mindset. So really that could equate to that growth mindset. So being open to growth and feedback, and where the students aren't just striving to get an A+, but they're really, there to learn and to grow. And then another factor that supports persistence is really institutional support. So supporting students to give them tips and strategies to really balance everything, manage their stress so that they can persist to graduation. So I've talked a lot about stress. So now I want to talk a little bit about stress and mind wandering. So what we know, like I said, is that our students are stressed. And in the literature, it shows that increased stress can lead to an increase in mind wandering. And just to be clear, mind wandering is a distraction from an external stimulus to a self-generated internal thought, usually completely unrelated, okay? And at baseline, the mind wanders 50% of the time. So that means that during my 20-minute presentation, I'm lucky if you guys are with me for about 10 minutes, right? So if the mind already wanders 50% of the time, and our students are stressed and stress increases mind wandering, that number could be more. So what that could mean for our students is that when they're trying to focus on schoolwork and listening to lectures, their mind could be thinking of something else. There are other life stressors, work, family, financials, etc. And that could really impact their academic performance. So just a little bit more about stress and mind wandering. So I'm just going to give a little overview about the stress response real quick. So, I'm sure we all know of the fight or flight response. So when our body senses something that's stressful, we release adrenaline, and our heart rate gets faster, our breathing becomes faster, our blood pressure goes up. And the goal is really to get, blood flow to our muscles, because it's, back in, caveman days, think of it as you encounter a bear and you have to either fight or run or flight, right? So the same thing is happening now, but what's happening is that just a thought can trigger a fight or flight response. So there might be no threat, there's no actual stressor, but just a stressful thought can trigger this fight or flight response and trigger us to have that surge of adrenaline and increase heart rate, increase respiratory rate, and so on. And then the problem is, once the stress has ended or the thought, goes away, we don't just, okay, back to normal, now we're in a relaxed state. We have sustained stress, and a lot of people have chronic stress. And with chronic stress, our body releases cortisol, and cortisol causes inflammation of our organs, inflammation of our circulatory system, and inflammation of the brain, specifically the amygdala. And the amygdala is a central place for our fear and stress response. So when I talk about mindfulness studies, this is going to come up and as really important, but that cortisol has been shown, like I said, to cause hypertrophy or an enlargement of the amygdala. Now, what's really important here is that it's the level of perceived stress that impacts our health, not the level of objective stress. So in my study, I looked at perceived stress, and that's what is really studied in the literature, because if you have two individuals, both are, graduate students, both have a family, both are working, one individual could perceive the stress as really manageable and, something they can get through. The other could perceive the stress as overwhelming and unmanageable. Well, that person that perceives it as overwhelming, that's the person that's going to have the negative health consequences. So it's really important that we look at perceived stress and we understand really the impact that perceived stress can have on our health. And there have been studies to show actual physical impact. So for example, one study looked at telomeres, which are the protective casings on the end of chromosomes. And they found that increased perceived stress actually shortened these telomeres more than objective stress, which was really, really a fascinating study. So like I said, it also can lead to mind wandering. So a little bit about mind wandering. Like I said, it's a distraction from an external stimulus to a self-generated internal thought. So, you know, if we're really stressed about something, our minds will often ruminate, which means it's kind of like stuck in a thought. So it could be a stressful thought. And if we're trying to focus on, you know, a lecture, let's say, and we keep having these recurring thoughts, oftentimes we don't even realize that our mind wanders and shifts to this internal thought. And then we no longer are paying attention in the present moment. We can't retain that information. So like I said, it can really lead to poor academic performance because we're no longer present in the moment. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to mindfulness. Mindfulness has been found in the literature to help to decrease levels of perceived stress and decrease levels of mind wandering. So mindfulness is defined as intentionally paying attention in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So mindfulness is not, you know, a religion, it's not a philosophy, it's really just a state of being in the present moment. So I'm going to just talk a little bit more about what mindfulness is and how I kind of, you know, a little bit of the background. So mindfulness certainly has Buddhist roots, right? And so it's been around for a really long time. But in about 1979 is when John Kabat-Zinn brought it to the United States. And he started these mindfulness-based stress reduction clinics. They're 8-week courses. And people started researching it and really showing that, wow, like this is incredibly beneficial but they started out with patients. So since then, the research has just exploded. And, you know, one of the most common research benefits, like I said, is decreased levels of perceived stress, so self-report perceived stress. But there's other just fascinating research. I'm going to share one article or one research study that was done. This is a landmark study. But what they did is they took people who had higher than average stress rates and they put them through that 8-week course that I talked about. And, you know, at the end, they saw that there was decreased levels of perceived stress. But they also did MRIs beginning and end. And what they found was actually decreased amygdala gray matter. So remember I said that that cortisol increases the amygdala and causes hypertrophy? Well, they actually found that practicing mindfulness can actually cause structural changes in the brain, like the decreased size of the amygdala. So fascinating. Then there's been, you know, other studies now where we're using it with students. So mindfulness has really gone mainstream, and K through 12 has really embraced it. So there's a lot of studies with kids from K through 12. And higher education is a little bit slower, but we're starting to bring it into higher education and working with college students. So one of the studies that I want to share with you was done recently. It came out in 2017, and they created a 2-week online mindfulness course. It was called Learning Mindfulness Online, delivered via Moodle. And what they did is they had 3 separate groups. So a control group, and then they had a group of students that took this 2-week class, and they had formal meditations assigned. So 10 minutes a day of meditations. And then they had a group that took the 2-week course without any meditations. And what they found was that both groups that went through the course with and without the formal meditations actually had decreased levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. So what that showed is that students don't need to go through a full 8-week course to see benefits, but also students don't need to actually do formal meditations to see the benefits. And why that is so important is that, one, our students are busy. They are, like I've said it a bunch of times, they're juggling so much. So to fit an 8-week course in is not realistic. But in 2 weeks, they were able to see positive benefits. Also, without formal meditation. So not everybody is ready to really start infusing meditations into their daily life. So just learning about it and using some of the other techniques where you can practice bringing mindful awareness to your day was really beneficial. So that was a really fantastic study as well, and one that really supports my study. So now I'm going to move a little bit into, or I'm going to move into my dissertation study. So here's my problem statement. So persistence for non-traditional students enrolled in graduate education is a challenge due to stress, which can decrease attention, increase mind wandering, and affect academic performance. Therefore, research is needed on the effects of implementing mindfulness in online graduate programs. So the purpose of this explanatory sequential dissertation was to examine relationships between and factors related to student persistence, stress, and mind wandering, and to explore the impact of teaching mindfulness to online graduate students. Okay, so I'm going to share here the study design and some preliminary findings. So here are my 4 research questions. The first is, are online graduate students' self-reported levels of stress, mind wandering, and persistence significantly related? Are there significant differences in online graduate students' self-reported levels of stress, mind wandering, and persistence when comparing before and after completion of an open access course? What are the perceptions of online graduate students who complete an open access mindfulness course? And then lastly, what factors do online graduate students identify as contributing to stress, mind wandering, and persistence? So here's my research design. So what I did is I sent an email out, an invitation out to all students in the School of Education and the College of Nursing and Health Professions, inviting them to take an open access mindfulness course, which I'll talk about when I get to my intervention. And then when the students clicked on this link, they were asked if they were an online graduate student. And those that were invited to participate in the study. So students could still enroll in the course if they didn't want to enroll in the study. But students that did want to enroll in the study were put into a separate shell in Blackboard, and they were invited to take the pre-survey. So the pre-survey included some demographic questions, and it included 3 valid and reliable instruments. So the College Persistence Questionnaire, the Perceived Stress Scale, and the Mind Wandering Questionnaire. So after the students took the pre-survey, it was then the intervention. So the intervention was this open access mindfulness course. And Dr. Betts had led a group of doctoral students through the completion, or through building this mindfulness course. So I'm so thankful to my fellow doctoral students who helped me in designing this course. So it had 3 modules. So the first one was mindfulness and personal well-being. Second one was mindfulness and learning. And the third one was culture, community, and mindfulness. So we were very intentional in building this. We had only 3 modules, and in each module, we made sure to include just, the relevant information. Short articles, short engaging videos, and really used a design that, helped guide students through the shell so that it was easy to follow, easy to understand. And for the purpose of this study, I only used the module 1 on the module I developed, mindfulness and personal well-being, as it included foundational mindfulness information related to mindfulness and stress, and mindfulness and sleep. So I thought it was the perfect information needed for a student to learn mindfulness. So then after they did the intervention, they had 3 weeks to complete module 1. They were emailed a post-survey. So this was all through Qualtrics. They took the same 3 tools, instruments, and then I did a qualitative analysis, which I will talk about. And I also asked students if they were interested in participating in an interview. I had a total of 6 students that I selected to participate in the interview, and I used maximum variation sampling to try to get a nice sample of students. And then I used a semi-structured interview template. We interviewed through Zoom, and afterwards I coded all my data and then used some triangulation interpretation to really bring all of my data together. So I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be quick here. I had 104 students enroll in the study, and then I had 31 students who completed the pre and post survey and module 1. And then I had 6 students who participated in the interview. So what I found, again, this is preliminary, first of all, was that so our online graduate students' self-reported levels of stress, mind wandering, and persistence significantly related. Well, I found a significant positive correlation between mind wandering and perceived stress on the pre and post survey using Pearson correlations. there was a negative correlation between perceived stress and persistence and mind wandering and persistence. However, the only one that was statistically significant was on that post survey when I looked at persistence and perceived stress. And then when I looked at the differences between the pre and post scores, what I found was statistically significant lower levels of self-report perceived stress and mind wandering after module 1. So that was exciting. The levels of persistence were higher, but not statistically significant. And then looking at the qualitative data, overall, the students really enjoyed the class. They thought it was a really great foundation that was easy to understand. They mentioned the videos a lot, and they felt that it really impacted their level of mind wandering more so than their stress. But it really helped them to pay attention in the present moment and notice when their mind had wandered, which was really important. And then in terms of what factors contribute to each of these variables, the biggest one that kind of threaded throughout was balance. So for each of these, mind wandering, persistence, and stress, the students talked about how balancing multiple commitments was a huge contributing factor. And then in terms of persistence, some other things that came up were being organized, having a supportive family, and really letting go of self-limiting beliefs, such as even perfectionism was one that had come up. So there were some limitations. I did use a convenience sample, so there was no random sampling. I did not use a control group. And this was a 3-module course, like I said, but I only chose to use that first module. So just implications, super quick. Schools are struggling with persistence and attrition. So we need to find ways to retain our students and to help our students identify ways to balance and manage their stress. And what I have found is that this open access course was able to decrease levels of perceived stress and decrease levels of mind wandering after just module 1. So offering this to all students is something that should be done. We should educate the whole student and not just in their area of academic studies. And doing it early on was something else that emerged that really needs to happen. So when the students are admitted is when we need to start offering this course. And just for further research, it's really, I think, important to see what is the long-term effects of doing this. Do we retain students? And then, we can look at things too, like if I did not include formal meditations in this module, but what if I had? Would, the results have been different? Would they have been better? So those are just 2 of the research implications. So that's the end. So thank you so much. I'm sorry, I think I went a little over, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Questions for Jackie in the room or online? But Jackie, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. I really do believe you contributed something significant to helping us figure out ways to help support our online students. So thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, so everybody, thank you. Please join me in thanking Jackie again, and also Mark. It was a great doctoral colloquium, very different topics, but both very, very interesting. And please join us on February 10th. From noon to 1 for our next doctoral colloquium. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay, good job, thank you.
And remember, Jamila, last year we were trying to find a replacement date because it snowed this day.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we had a lot of.
Oh my God, we spent like months trying to figure out.
There was like some big meeting and we had